On a Sunday afternoon in 18th century London, a well-dressed family might decide to make a day of it. They would put on their good coats, walk across the city, and pass through a magnificent iron gate beneath two enormous stone figures, one writhing, one slumped in despair. Inside, they would stroll down a long gallery, chatting and laughing, past cell after cell of chained human beings. Some of the inmates screamed at them, some begged, some simply stared, and the visitors would look and point and move on to the next one, because this was not a hospital, not really. It was an attraction. It was somewhere you took the family on a slow afternoon, the way you might visit the lions at the Tower of London. This was Bedlam. And what happened inside it, for nearly 600 years, is one of the darkest stories in the history of medicine, because for most of that time, nobody was even trying to hide it. A quick warning before we go further: this one is grim, and every word of it is true. Its real name was the Hospital of St. Mary of Bethlehem, founded in London in the year 1247. It began as a priory, a religious house, meant to collect alms, and somewhere over the following century and a half, it began taking in the mad. By the 1400s, it was doing so systematically, which makes it the oldest institution in Europe dedicated to the care of the mentally ill, and one of the oldest anywhere on earth. Londoners, being Londoners, could not be bothered with the full name. Bethlehem became Bethlem, and Bethlem became Bedlam. And the word slid so completely into the language that we still use it today. When you call a chaotic scene Bedlam, you are naming a real building, and the real people who were kept inside it. And here is the first strange thing. If you had walked past it in the late 1600s, you would not have seen a grim fortress. You would have seen a palace. In 1676, Bedlam moved into a magnificent new building at Moorfields, long, elegant, symmetrical, with formal gardens and sweeping wings, so grand that people compared it to a royal palace in France. It was designed to impress. It was designed to be looked at. And above the gates crouched two enormous carved stone figures, writhing in chains, one representing raving madness, the other melancholy, so that every single person who entered passed underneath a sculpture of what they were about to see. Behind that beautiful facade, the building was falling apart, almost from the day it opened, damp, freezing, the walls cracking, sewage running beneath the cells. The palace was a stage set, and the show was the people inside it, because visitors came. For generations, the public could walk into Bedlam and look at the patients. It is often said that they paid a penny at the gate for the privilege. That specific detail is disputed by historians, and the truth of how the visiting was managed is murkier than the legend suggests. But that people came in their thousands, that they came for entertainment, and that it went on for well over a century, that is not in doubt at all. It was a recognized London amusement, listed alongside the theatres and the menagerie. Writers of the day described the noise of it, the rattling of chains, the shouting, the laughter of the crowd. Some visitors brought food, some brought drink, some poked at the inmates through the bars to make them react, because a placid madman was a disappointing one. And you should hold this thought as we go on, because it is the key to everything that follows. For most of Bedlam's history, the people inside it were not regarded as patients to be healed. They were regarded as spectacles to be viewed. If the buried corners of our own history keep pulling you in like this, take a second to subscribe. Digging up the grimmest true stories our species has left behind is the entire reason this channel exists. And stay with this one, because we're about to look at who ended up in those cells and why, and it is far closer to home than you might like. So who were they? Some were, unmistakably, people in the depths of severe mental illness, suffering terribly, with nowhere else on earth to go. But the gates of an asylum in this age were remarkably easy to be pushed through. Across the era of the great asylums, people were confined for grief that had gone on too long after a death, for epilepsy, which was widely misunderstood as madness, for religious fervor of the wrong kind, for drinking, for debt and destitution. Women, especially, could be committed for what were vaguely called disorders of the womb, for refusing a marriage, for being unmanageable, for a temper their husband found intolerable. And once a respectable man had signed the paper, the burden of proof fell not on the family, but on the person inside the cell. Think about that. In many cases, the only way out was to convince the very people who had locked you up that you were sane while living in conditions that would drive anyone to breaking point. And what was done to you once you were inside? For most of Bedlam's history, nothing that we would recognize as treatment. The medicine of the day still believed in the four humors, so madness was an imbalance to be forced out of the body. You were bled. You were purged. You were given powerful emetics to make you vomit, again and again. Sometimes, as a seasonal ritual, patients were routinely bled and purged every spring. Whether they needed it or not, because that was simply the schedule. You were plunged into freezing water on the theory that shock would restore the mind. You were strapped into chairs. You were chained to walls. And in the early 1800s, some asylums adopted a device that must have felt like something out of a nightmare. A rotating chair, into which the patient was strapped, and then spun, faster and faster, for minutes at a time, until they were vomiting, bleeding from the nose, and utterly senseless. This was considered a therapy. It was believed to shake the madness loose. None of it worked. All of it was terrifying. And for those judged incurable, there was no schedule of treatment at all, only the cell, and the chain, and the years. Which brings us to the man who broke Bedlam open. In 1814, a reformer named Edward Wakefield went into Bedlam to inspect it, and in one of the cells, he found an American sailor named James Norris. Norris had been fitted into a custom-built iron harness, a bar riveted to the wall, an iron collar around his neck, and a heavy iron frame clamped about his body, pinning his arms to his sides. He could stand. He could take one short step. He could lie down. That was the entire range of movement he had been permitted. He had been kept like that, according to the accounts of the time, for something in the order of a decade. And when Wakefield spoke to him, Norris answered, rationally, coherently, and with dignity. He talked about what he had read. He talked about the world outside. He was, by every account of that meeting, entirely lucid. The image of James Norris in his iron frame was drawn, printed, and circulated across Britain, and the country recoiled. It triggered a parliamentary inquiry into the treatment of the insane, and the inquiry dragged into the open exactly what everyone had always known and never quite looked at: the filth, the chains, the beatings, the deaths. Norris himself died within a year of being found. His health had been destroyed long before anyone came looking for him. And slowly, far too slowly, the world began to change. A new idea was already taking root, called moral treatment. The radical proposition that the mentally ill were not animals but people, and that they might respond to kindness, quiet, useful work, and the simple experience of being treated as human beings. In England, a Quaker tea merchant named William Tuke founded a retreat in York built on exactly that principle, with no chains at all. In France, the physician Philippe Pinel became famous for striking the irons from the insane, although historians now argue that the credit belongs at least as much to a hospital superintendent named Jean-Baptiste Poussin, who was doing it first, and that the dramatic story of Pinel personally unchaining the mad is more legend than record. The chains came off. The public visiting ended. Bedlam itself still exists today as a modern psychiatric hospital, and it is now a genuinely respected institution with a museum on its grounds, where you can see the two great stone figures that once crouched over the gate. But the word stayed in our language, and that is the part that ought to unsettle us. Every time we say Bedlam, we are casually invoking the suffering of real people whose only crime, in many cases, was grief or poverty or inconvenience, and whose torment was so ordinary, so accepted, so profoundly unremarkable, that respectable families brought their children to watch it on a Sunday afternoon and thought nothing of it at all. They were not monsters. They were ordinary people, doing what everybody around them did, in a world that had simply decided these particular human beings did not fully count. So here is the question worth sitting with, and it is not a comfortable one. Those visitors saw nothing wrong with what they were doing. Which of the things we do today, casually, respectably, without a second thought, will look exactly like that in 300 years? Tell us what you think down in the comments.